They laughed at them for being quiet. They didn't realize silence was the scariest warning. It started with a shove in the courtyard just after the lunch bell. Two white boys in varsity jackets, loud, cocky, dripping entitlement, stepped in front of the Carter twins. Nia and Nova stood still, arms folded, expressions unreadable. "Hey, twins," one of them barked. "You lost, or just too scared to speak English?" The crowd nearby chuckled, unsure if they were witnessing a joke or something uglier. A phone came out. Another followed. But the girls said nothing. No retort, no retreat. Just stillness, like the eye of a coming storm. The boys didn't stop. They mimicked karate stances mockingly, threw slurs like punches, certain they'd win without lifting a finger. They thought the girls would run. What happened next made everyone back away. Where are you watching from? If you believe silence is strength, this story will hit home. Nia and Nova Carter had always moved through the world like water, calm on the surface, powerful underneath. At 16, the twin sisters were known at Westbrook Prep for being quiet, well-mannered, and sharply intelligent. They kept to themselves, gliding through hallways without needing attention. What most people didn't know was that the Carter twins had been training in martial arts since they were 6. Their father, a disciplined instructor and a former military man, had raised them with a code: control, respect, defense, not aggression. They didn't speak unless necessary, didn't act unless provoked. But beneath their calm was a fire that knew exactly how to defend itself. And yet, that silence, their grace, was constantly mistaken for weakness. In a school where only a handful of students looked like them, where coaches called on loud boys and teachers praised the familiar, Nia and Nova learned to carry the burden of being judged before they ever spoke. Across the courtyard, Dylan and Trent reigned in a different way. Classic prep school jocks, both wore their varsity jackets like crowns. Loud, smug, and quick to joke, they floated on the assumption that nothing could touch them. They weren't just popular, they were protected. They mocked what they didn't understand, laughed off anything that didn't mirror them. When they looked at the Carter twins, all they saw were two quiet black girls who didn't know their place. The school itself was polished, ivy-covered, steeped in legacy and traditions, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Silent racism, unspoken favoritism, the type of privilege that didn't need to declare itself to be felt. In that environment, confrontation wasn't a question of if, but when. And when it came, it would rewrite everything. It started with whispers in the hallway, ugly, slow-burning words that spread like smoke. Someone said the Carter twins were too proud, that they didn't know their place. At Westbrook Prep, that kind of talk wasn't shouted. It was slipped between lockers, smuggled inside jokes, and passed around like rumor candy. The twins, as always, ignored it. They walked with purpose, heads high, silence intact. But silence only seemed to provoke the loud. On a golden afternoon, during lunch break in the courtyard, Dylan decided to act. He strutted toward them with Trent close behind, their red varsity jackets catching sunlight like flags raised for war. They stood tall, grinning, while the girls stood still, dark blue hoodies zipped up, arms folded like iron bars across their chests. "You two really think you run this place?" Dylan barked, voice amplified by his need to be seen. "Acting like you're better than the rest of us." Trent chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, man, they're just shy. Or maybe it's hard to talk when you're too busy playing ninja." In the mirror. The laughter wasn't loud, but it stung in its casual cruelty. A few students nearby paused their conversations. Phones slid out from pockets. The moment was changing shape. Nia didn't blink. Nova didn't even shift her stance. They just watched, calm, unreadable. They didn't blink, one bystander later said, not because they were scared, but because blinking would mean giving it attention. Their silence unnerved Dylan, who stepped closer, puffing out his chest. "What? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're scared we might break those little karate dreams of yours." He nudged Trent with an elbow. "Heard y'all think you're tough or something." The contrast was stark. Red against blue. Noise against stillness. Arrogance facing discipline. The courtyard grew quiet. Eyes turned. A crowd was forming, drawn by the tension. The kind of tension that either explodes or collapses. Dylan's grin stretched wider, fueled by the attention. He leaned in. "Say something." "Or what? You gonna meditate me to death?" That's when Nova spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "You sure you want to do this?" For a beat, there was nothing. No wind, no laughter, just silence, the kind that holds its breath. Dylan snorted. "Please, what are you gonna do?" he said, turning to the crowd, arms raised in mock surrender. "Talk me into peace?" But the way the twins looked at him, unmoved, grounded, it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. And in that quiet second before anything happened, something in the crowd shifted. They couldn't name it, but they could feel it. The air was about to change. Dylan lunged without warning, a blur of red fury fueled by ego and the belief that nothing could stop him. But the moment he moved, time seemed to slow. Nia stepped to the side with surgical precision, letting his momentum carry him forward into open space. At the same time, Nova's hand rose like water rising to meet a stone. Fluid, graceful, inevitable. She didn't punch. She didn't shout. She simply caught Trent's wrist mid-swing, twisted, and brought him to the ground in a single fluid motion. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone's phone slipped from their fingers and clattered to the pavement. In less than 10 seconds, both boys were on their knees, breathless and stunned, their arms pinned in ways they couldn't escape. The Carter twins hadn't raised their voices. They hadn't even broken a sweat. They moved like they were painting. In the air, brushstrokes of warning turned into power. Nia loosened her hold, letting Dylan fall back against the concrete. Nova released Trent slowly, stepping back without a word. The silence that followed was not empty. It was reverent. The students watching didn't cheer. They didn't laugh. They simply stared, as if they'd just seen something sacred. "We're not here to fight," Nia said, her voice even, controlled. "But we don't run either." There was no anger in her tone, just truth. Cold, unshakable truth. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The boys, all noise and flame, had been snuffed out by control. The twins hadn't thrown wild punches. They'd used balance, redirection, and restraint. The kind of strength that doesn't come from power, but from knowing when not to use it. The principal arrived just as Dylan tried to scramble to his feet, embarrassment painted across his face. He took one look at the scene, the twins standing calm, the crowd frozen, the bullies humbled, and didn't need to ask a thing. His eyes found Nia and Nova, and something unreadable passed between them. Not suspicion, not disbelief, just quiet, recognition. The girls took one final step back, their composure intact, their message delivered without cruelty. No gloating, no threats, just calm. Because when you know your strength, you don't have to perform it. You just have to let others see it. And on that courtyard ground, surrounded by fallen pride and stunned silence, strength had never been clearer. Later that afternoon, the truth began to unfold. Not in whispers this time, but in headlines. Nia and Nova Carter weren't just quiet girls with good posture. They were state-level black belt champions, trained in martial arts since childhood by their late father, a respected military veteran who believed that true power didn't need to shout. Their discipline wasn't born in a gym. It was forged in their living room, beneath framed medals and faded photos, during hours of practice laced with lessons on patience, control, and dignity. What happened in the courtyard wasn't an accident. It was restraint, precision, legacy. As the story spread, so did the video. Phones had captured every second. Not just the confrontation, but the way the girls had stepped back after defending themselves, composed and unshaken. It wasn't the takedown that went viral. It was the grace with which they let their bullies walk away. Among the crowd that day was a parent who had stopped by to drop off paperwork, a black father who had seen the whole thing unfold from his car. He was the first to speak publicly. Those girls could have broken bones, he told the school board, but they chose to walk away. That's what you should be teaching here. His voice shook the room harder than any punch could. Dylan and Trent were suspended within 24 hours, not just for aggression, but for racial harassment. But more importantly, their armor of protection cracked. Students came forward with stories, comments, taunts, quiet cruelties that had been overlooked for too long. The school board, under public pressure, began reviewing its record of unresolved racial complaints. And suddenly silence wasn't an excuse anymore. Ms. Coleman, the history teacher, stood before her class days later and looked directly at Nia and Nova. Her voice trembled as she said, "I should have stood up for them sooner." It was more than an apology. It was an awakening. The poetic twist was clear. Dylan and Trent had come to tear them down with fists, but were undone by poise. In trying to humiliate them, they had handed the Carter twins a platform, and the world listened. Not to the sound of violence, but to the power of stillness. And in that stillness, change began to stir. The weeks that followed didn't change Nia and Nova Carter, but they changed everything around them. The school that once overlooked them now invited them to lead. When a statewide youth leadership summit sent an invitation asking them to speak, the girls hesitated at first. They weren't used to microphones or stages, but they agreed. Not to bask in attention, but to make something clear. Standing side by side under the soft lights of the auditorium, Nova looked out at rows of young faces and said, "Black doesn't mean weak, and quiet doesn't mean scared. Sometimes it means we've been listening, watching, learning when to speak, and when to act." Their message wasn't flashy, it was grounded. They spoke about discipline, balance, and knowing when to stand, firm, about the power of walking away and the strength it takes to stay still until the moment is right. No anger, no blame, just truth. Back at Westbrook Prep, the ripple effects continued. Dylan's family, after a flood of public backlash and reflection, issued a formal apology. Not scripted, not forced, honest. His younger sister, inspired by what she'd seen, quietly joined the same martial arts school where the twins had trained for years. It wasn't a gesture for attention. It was curiosity, a bridge, and the Carter twins welcomed her like they would anyone else. No fanfare, no judgment, just the same calm grace they had always carried. The school itself made changes too. Real ones. Anti-bullying programs became more than posters in the hallway. Teachers underwent bias awareness training. Student leaders formed equity committees. The quiet was no longer a place for assumptions to grow. It became a space to listen. And through it all, Nia and Nova stayed exactly as they were. No interviews, no Instagram fame. They still walked the halls in their navy hoodies, still folded, their arms in class when they were thinking. They didn't want to be heroes. They just refused to be victims. And yet, something was different. When they walked the same hallway where it all began, heads turned. Not out of suspicion or curiosity, but respect. Classmates stepped aside with nods. Teachers paused to greet them with sincerity. Even the silence around them felt new. It didn't weigh them down anymore. It rose with them. The world hadn't just seen what they could do. It had learned what they stood for. And in that learning, a piece of the school's story was rewritten. Not with fists or fear, but with calm, unstoppable grace. They never raised their voices. They just rose, and the world finally saw. Nia and Nova didn't need to prove anything. They simply showed up, stood their ground, and let their actions speak with more power than any words ever could. In a world that too often mistakes silence for weakness, they became a living reminder that real strength isn't loud. It's focused, balanced, and deeply rooted in self-respect. Have you ever been judged before you even spoke? Have you ever been sized up, overlooked, or dismissed simply because of how you look, or how quietly you carry yourself? If so, this story is for you. Share it if you believe silence can be strength, and the power doesn't always need to shout to be heard. Drop your city in the comments and follow for more real stories where justice flips the script and quiet grace wins. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stand strong, even when the world misreads your silence.